Women's Night In at the library. We are absolutely thrilled at the turnout. And soon we're going to have to close the doors if anybody else shows up. No, we're really, really pleased to see you. And we have a very special, is this okay? A really special event. This is Valerie Van Kooten, who has come to us from Pella. And she's a Pella native, and I'm going to read some of her brochure. She's been collecting vintage clothing and their histories for the past 10 years. She has amassed over 3,000 pieces dating from the 1850s to the 1970s. 90% of these were worn by Iowa women. And they are being worn by Iowa women right now as we speak in the back. One lady's from Turkey. It's really cool. Valerie teaches technical writing at Central College in Pella, and she's a freelance writer and editor. For the past 7 years, she's been a member of the Humanities Iowa Speakers Bureau, and she's become known in Iowa as an authority on women's fashion history. She's currently writing a book. Oh, cool. We'll get a signed copy. On how history and fashion have affected each other. And if you want more information, we've got it here, and Valerie's here, so you can certainly talk to her after the presentation. So without further ado, we'll get started. We're just really thrilled you're here. And oh, another important thing, the evening is being sponsored by the Friends of the Library. The Friends of the Library have paid for it, so we have a wonderful Friends organization. And the refreshments that you're all invited to partake of will be in the meeting room after the presentation, and they have been brought to you by the friendly staff of your library. Women and one man! Yay! I have to tell you, Jim actually baked also. Jim, we've got cookies from Jim back there, so please, after the presentation, please join us in the meeting room for coffee and punch and homemade cookies. And okay, here you go.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Well, again, my name is Val Van Kooten. I am from Pella. To tell you a little bit about what I've been doing with Iowa women's clothing, you may think, what the heck is she doing with 3,000 pieces of clothing? I started picking up things when I was a student at Iowa State back in the early 80s, and never really intended to begin collecting. That wasn't really my goal. When I was in college, we bought things at secondhand shops, a lot of 40s and 50s suits, and wore them. You could pick them up for $3 or $4. And it was something I was interested in. And after I got out of college, I started collecting things, finding things cheap, picking them up, bringing them home. And when I hit about the 1,000 piece mark, my husband said, well, are you going to do something with this stuff or what? Or are you just going to keep collecting? So about 10, 12 years ago, I began doing presentations to show women, or show people, not just women, but show people what women's lives were like through the clothing that they wore. And I know my models, I've been talking with them, a lot of people have a real nostalgic notion about the clothing of the era. A lot of people will come up before a show and say, oh, I missed my era, I wish I'd lived back then. And unfortunately, usually afterwards they come up and say, oh, I'm glad I didn't live back then. Because the clothing is beautiful. I love to look at it. It tells you a lot about a woman's lifestyle. But I don't think most of us would want to have to wear it, especially the undergarments and the corseting and everything that went with it. So where do I get my information? Where do I get my clothes? I used to go to a lot of auctions and things. I don't have time to do that. I'm married. I teach at Central College. I do a lot of writing. I have 3 little boys. Most of the clothing that I get anymore comes from people who come to shows and they bring it, or they get little boxes in the mail. I got one a few months ago that said, to Valerie Van something. I couldn't even read the last name. Pella, Iowa. And then it said underneath, I don't know her address, but this is the lady who collects old clothes. And that's the advantage of living in a small town. My postman knew where it had to go. Sometimes they end up at the local library or the Chamber of Commerce, and they'll call me and say, there's another box here for you. But I feel very humbled by that. I get a lot of Iowa's fashion history from women who don't know what to do with it. Their kids don't want it. They know they're going to a smaller apartment or a nursing facility, and they don't know what to do with it. So I end up with a lot of history that way. And it's a wonderful thing to hear their stories and put it together. I'm trying to get a book written. I have talked to University of Iowa Press. I think it is a possibility because what I really want to do is catalog the histories of these women who still remember what they wore during World War I. There are still women there. Women who were flappers in the 20s. You know, they're still out there, but in another 5 to 10 years they won't be. And Iowa State University Press did give me a contract to write a book, but they wanted a textbook. And I said, no, that's not what I want to do. I want an anecdotal book that people will read and that is interesting, not a textbook. So I'm starting over with Iowa City, and I'm hoping that that happens in the next year or two. It's all up here. It's written up here, but it's not written out yet. If I know the history of a piece, I'll tell you that. To me, it's just as important to get the history of the piece and the woman who wore it as it is to get the clothing, because you learn a lot about the woman that way. So tonight we'll go on about 110, 120 years of fashion in Iowa, and I think you'll see a real difference as we go along. Our first model, come on in. Anne is wearing a suit that came from Davenport from about 1890. A lot of interesting things about this suit. The woman who gave it to me was the great-granddaughter of the woman who wore it. And she told me a lot about her great-grandmother. She was the daughter of a riverboat captain. She lived in one of the huge houses in Davenport that overlooked the Mississippi. It was a very wealthy family. And I knew that. I could tell that before she even told me, because when I got it, I don't think it had been worn. It still had the basting threads. Yeah, we'll have her come up after I'm done, okay? Yeah, they will. Don't go yet. That's not what I want to talk about. It still had the basting threads and everything, and I don't think it had been worn. So evidently she was wealthy enough that she had it made and then didn't like it, the color or the fit or whatever. So she put it away, and it was never worn. This is a walking suit. By that I mean it was cut very large, you know, around the bottom so you could actually walk in it. And that sounds kind of funny, but if you had seen skirts just 10 years prior to this, in the 1870s and early 1880s, the hobble skirt was in style. And the hobble skirt was a skirt that was so tight from the knees down that women literally had to hobble in it and take very small steps. So when the walking suit came in, you know, women's magazines are heralding this as, wow, women can actually walk and get around in it. Some puzzling things about it. It has a very large waistline. We always have to pin it up. It has about a 36, 37 inch waist. It has very narrow shoulders. And you know, for a long time I thought, boy, this woman was really strangely shaped. But what occurred to me after looking at the way it was constructed is that what it's missing is the bustle that would have been worn with it. And a good bustle would take, you know, 6, 8, 10 inches of extra fabric around the waistline. So the bustle, ever since she probably didn't wear it, there was never a bustle to go with it, but it was made for a bustle. It is a walking suit. It's brown. That's not a coincidence. You know, if you were walking in Davenport in the 1890s, there were no sidewalks. If there were, they were wooden. It was dusty, it was dirty, you were going to get dirty, so brown was a practical color. You get a lot of clothing from this era, brown, gray, black, navy, not only because it was practical, but because it was sober. You know, a married woman in 1900 was not wearing red. That was what a prostitute would have worn. A married woman in 1900 was not wearing bright pink. You just didn't do that. In fact, one magazine from 1900 says, if you can only afford one dress this year, make sure it's a dress you can wear to a funeral. So that was the practicality. And you find that over and over again. Iowa women, Midwest women were very practical. And they chose practical colors, practical styles, practical fabrics that they could wear again and again and that they could use for other purposes. The hat is a real typical Victorian hat. Lots of birds, braids, and feathers. Birds were a very big motif for Victorian women. We have a black bird here. We have an owl. You can see his little beak. He's missing an eye. But birds were very big. Bird houses were a very big thing. If you read old magazines, I read one, this man wrote an article and said if he was bored in church, he would count the numbers of bird houses on women's hats in church. So that was a big thing. Fruits and vegetables were also very big, artificial fruits and vegetables. And to complete this, if she was walking, she would have a veil or something around her face to complete this and to keep her face clean and keep her makeup clean. And I've had people say, well, women back then didn't wear makeup, and that's not true. Most women wore some sort of makeup. Almost every woman had what was called a chamois. It was like a pad of powder, and you ran a chamois pad across it, you dampened it. It was like an early liquid makeup. Many women were darkening their eyebrows with burned out matches. Rouge was, my great grandma talked about that when I was a little girl. girl. Rouge was available, although nice women did not buy it or use it. Instead, you bought pink or red crepe paper and you dampened it and you used the ink off the crepe paper to make your cheeks pink or red. So when we're talking makeup, we're not talking Revlon. We're talking, homemade remedies. Do any of you remember baking flour to make face powder? Or have your mothers talk about that? I've had women who remember doing that on Saturday mornings, baking flour in the oven on a cookie sheet type thing until it was brown, and then you'd make it into smaller pieces and use that for face powder. So these were very homemade remedies. This is an era, you start finding clothing that women were actually able to move in. You start finding bicycling outfits and golf outfits for women, although golf was very restricted, mostly to men, but some upper class women were playing golf, walking ensembles, croquet ensembles. But you have to remember, women were still corseted while they were doing it. And the saying of the day that every woman taught her daughter was that women glisten, men perspire, horses sweat. Okay, women did not sweat, and that was a rude, unladylike thing to say, that you were sweating. So when we say exercise or getting out, it was more walking and taking the air, that type of thing. It wasn't ladylike for a woman to be participating too actively in these sports. Thank you. We're going to let her walk around so you can look. It's a kind of a wool. Well, I don't know. That's the problem. With these old fabrics, I don't know, I call it horse blanket material. It's thick and it's heavy. And if any of you catch the news, do you get Des Moines news stations down here? The Savory Hotel, the election night, is running they're going to reenact a suffragist rally at the Savory Hotel, and the woman who's portraying Annie Savory, who was a big suffragist in Des Moines, is going to be wearing this outfit, so I'm hoping it gets on the news. A lot of my clothing also was just in the Masterpiece Theater, Cora Unashamed, and I saw, yes, they came and got several pieces, and I did glimpse it on extras who were in the crowd or walking across the street. None of the main characters did, but that was kind of fun to watch too. The main reason you should be glad you don't live in 1890 is the corset. A good corset would advertise itself as being able to take 8 to 10 inches off your natural waistline. They would start just under the bust line, go down over the hips, and compress everything in between there. So they were miserable garments. I haven't done any solid research on this, but I truly believe that the corset is what caused a lot of women to die in childbirth. Because when doctors would operate on women of childbearing age, they would often note in their journals that all of their internal organs were pushed in and up, just like a corset would push you. The uterus, the spleen, the kidney, the liver, everything was out of place. And so I believe that contributed to a lot of deaths in childbirth. If you've seen the movie, Gone with the Wind or Titanic, where they're standing by the bedpost, and yanking on the stays, that was a very common sight. In 1900 to 1910, depending on the year, women were working for anywhere from an 18 to a 22-inch waistline. Well, that's about that big. It's not very big. I've had women tell me, one woman told me that in 1910, when her mother was fully corseted, she had a 13-inch waistline. And I said, I don't mean to doubt you, but that just seems really hard to believe. And she goes, I know it does. But she said she was so vain about her small waist that every Saturday night she would measure it after she was corseted. She didn't want to give up that small waist. So it was a real point of pride for a lot of women to have that really tiny, tiny waist. Some upper class women, I have not found any examples of this in Iowa, but in Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, on the East Coast, many upper class women, in order to get a couple more inches off their waistline, were having their bottom ribs surgically removed. And that's, you think of how barbaric that is. Doctors would talk about this at the time, how these women wanted these bottom ribs removed. You could get another 2-3 inches off your waistline. And I was telling that to a home ec class about a year ago, and I was telling them how, can you imagine how horrible that was? And none of them looked like they thought that was a big deal. And I said, don't you think that's really horrible? And one girl raised her hand and she said, well, I know Cher and Madonna have both had ribs surgically removed. And I thought, That didn't seem very likely to me, but I thought, well, that's possible, I guess. Then a few months later, about 6-8 months ago, I was driving down the highway and Paul Harvey came on the radio. And he said, I have a note for those of you who are interested in fashion. Jane Fonda is resting comfortably in an LA hospital after having her bottom ribs surgically removed. This was April of last spring. Since then, I've read in People magazine that Dolly Parton has also had it done. So evidently that kind of thing is still going on. I know, can you imagine that? But that's what you did to sacrifice being able to have a smaller waist. Corsets, why did they go out of style? Well, for one reason, if you rip these open and feel these, they're steel. And during World War I, the rallying cry in ladies' magazines was, ladies, turn in your corsets for your country. And they were melted down for the war effort. In fact, there were a lot of jokes. One whole ship was made from ladies' corset steel. If you read old women's magazines, and that was a real point of pride for women, that they were contributing to the war effort by turning in their corsets. Now, when I talk to women, if I find women of that era, I always ask them, I'll bet women, your neighbors, your friends were really glad to get rid of corsets. And I have not heard anybody who says, oh yes, they were horrible. What I hear is either, my mother always was upset that she couldn't keep her waistline when corsets went out of style. Or what I hear more often is, my mom and my grandma always had back problems after corsets went out of style, because they kept you so tight, so rigid, that they kept your back almost perfectly straight, so you didn't have back problems. So that's what I hear more of than the fact that women were upset about the waist size, was the back problems. So corsets went out, in about 1917, 1918, when America entered World War I. Most of them were melted down. That's going to really change fashion as we get into the 20s, because we don't have corsets anymore.
Well, later on, my mother wore a garment.
A garment?
Yes. And
what year would that have been?
Oh, let's see, in the 30s.
30s? Mm-hmm. Really, their corsets were recycled. You had, anybody remember Merry Widows wearing those tight things? The girdle of the 60s, they weren't a whole lot better than a corset, actually. They just had a different name. Yeah. What'd they call it?
Garment.
A garment, okay.
She was quite busty, but small-waisted, and it was like a camisole and a girdle combined, and it hooked down.
Hooked on the side, okay.
And her back, it had stayed down the back.
Stays down the back, yep.
It helped so much.
Yeah, it did help. This is a wealthy woman's corset. How can I tell that? Because it takes two people to get into it. You had to get in it and have somebody pull the stays. So you had a maid or somebody to do that for you. Most Iowa women had the stays sewn into their jackets. If you find the jackets that have the stays sewn in, they would have originally had a track that connected the stays with like a type shoestring, and you'd yank them tight yourself in the front. So that was a do-it-yourself corset. So when you find the stays sewn into a jacket, that's a woman who wasn't as wealthy as someone who could afford an individual one and have somebody pull it tight for her. Our next model, come on. Fashion changed a lot in the early 1900s. Well, it changed a lot in 1901, at least it started to. Queen Victoria died in 1901. And when you think of the Victorian era, I think of the brown suit. Heavy braids, wools, feathers. She died, her son Edward took the throne. We get the Edwardian era of clothing. It took a little while to come into the US, a little longer than it did in Britain, but it changed fashion dramatically. The Edwardian look was a very light, very airy look. This was a lingerie, called a lingerie dress, and a lingerie dress was any dress that had to have a slip underneath it because it was sheer. What women tell me is that their mother or grandmother would have one dress, but they might have 3 or 4 slips of different colors, so you could change the look from week to week. You could have a blue slip or a mint green slip or a pink slip. So again, it was another practical measure. People ask me if it's a wedding dress. I don't know. It might have been a wedding dress. It might have been a high school or 8th grade graduation dress. Probably not an 8th grade graduation dress. The reason I know that is, well, whatever it started out as, it didn't end life that way. And boy, is this another example of Iowa women's practicality. Underneath these flaps here, there are slits with hooks and eyes for a nursing mother. Oh. So she converted it to a dress that she could nurse a baby in. And that is really unusual to find clothing that acknowledges that women were ever pregnant or nursing a baby for a couple of reasons. For one reason, if you were pregnant in 1900 or 1910, you were not expected to go out in public once you began to show. So you didn't need a lot of clothing. The other reason is almost every woman made her clothing so that she could wear it before pregnancy and then snap or hook or button it out during pregnancy and then snap or hook it back in. You didn't have separate maternity clothing. When you realize a lot of these women were pregnant every year, you know, you had clothing you could wear, you just adjusted the waistline basically. My husband's grandfather was one of 17, so with one wife. So, you know, these women were practical. They weren't going to have separate clothing. They would just have the same clothing that they could adjust. So that's unusual because when you look at even like old catalogs, I have a 1905 Sears catalog, you know, it never says like maternity clothing or pregnancy clothing. You have to really read between the lines. It says things like the perfect dress for the woman who will be making an addition to her home next spring. Yeah, you know, like she's remodeling her kitchen or something. British publications will, like Godey's Lady Book and some of those will say, the perfect frock for the woman who's expecting a little stranger, which is the British euphemism for pregnancy. So you have to look between the lines. This dress came from Ottumwa. I bought it at a farm auction just south of Ottumwa probably, 10 or 12 years ago. It was one of the first pieces I got. And this is the story that went with it. I got there late, and they had some clothing in brown paper bags on a hay rack. This was a farm auction. And I got there late. I didn't have a chance to look through it. And this one bag looked interesting. It had a skirt on top that was kind of neat. I bought the whole bag for 50 cents, and this dress was rolled up in the bottom of it. And rolled up with it, now she's not wearing the original shoes, but the original shoes were rolled up with it. And they were little silk, sort of like looked like ballet slippers with a bow on top, which tells me that it probably was a wedding dress or a graduation dress, because most women had the boots. They were much more practical. You only had the little slippers for very important occasions. So it probably did start life that way. So, but I don't know anything about the family. I don't know anything about the dress, but they were rolled up in the bottom of the bag, and I about fainted when I pulled them out. So, thank you. You may be wondering what bustles look like. This one's kind of falling apart, but this is a real little bustle from about 1900, a little wire one, and it had two long strings. It had one on each side, and then there was a hook on the end of both sides, and it would hook into the waistband of your skirt, so it wouldn't flop around. It hooked in pretty securely. It's a real small one. It looks kind of lays like a little pillow on the back, you know, kind of like, you know, this kind of a thing. But you can see where it would take some extra material. The heyday of the bustle was the 1870s and 1880s. In 1873, ladies' magazines are advising women that if you really want to be in style this spring, you will have a bustle that's big enough to set a tray of food on it and not have it fall off. And that was your barometer for how in style you were. We were at the Smithsonian Institution last summer, and they had a lingerie exhibit, and I couldn't believe I hit this. But they had bustles with tape measures beside them. And some of these were 28, 30, 32 inches straight back. And if you see pictures of women wearing them, they look like they're carrying a trunk, you know, under their clothing, straight back. They were very uncomfortable. They were very impractical. They had no reason for being other than for being an accessory. They made it hard for women to sit down. So what came in the next year after this ad or this article that said you need to have this huge bustle came the collapsible bustle. The Tucker Bustle Company came out with this, and I have an advertisement of this on my office wall, and I laugh every time I look at it because it says, the heading is, "Ladies, you too may now sit down at formal functions." And it shows this lady perching on the end of this chair, and supposedly this bustle, the whole thing would collapse. And it was almost like a hoop skirt, collapsing this whole thing, sitting on it. But I always wonder, I would love to talk to somebody who was around then and ask them what happened when you stood up. If they were like these little umbrellas, you know, that pop open. They had to have you were compressing all this stuff. The other invention that came in because of the bustle was the bustle chair. I don't know if any of you have seen a bustle chair. They have a straight back, just like a regular chair, but they have a really long seat, and they're only wire or springs like in the first 12 inches of the seat, because you were sitting on the first 12 inches, but your bustle was taking up the rest of it. They look like a long L. If you ever see them, a lot of people don't know what they are. They're getting pretty rare, but if, they go very high if people know what they are at an auction. But they're an interesting thing. So bustles, they were horrible things. By 1900, they were pretty much gone. Women wanted more freedom to do things. Another bustle that came in the 1880s that was really dreadful was called the waterfall bustle. It helped give you that beautiful cascading waterfall look on the back of your clothing. It would cascade down. Well, the bustle, I've got one of these at home, and it looks like 3 long door chimes together. They're about, 36 inches long, about a yard long, and they would connect around your waist. Well, then you had these 3 things bounced around back here, so it connected around your front of your knees too, so it wouldn't be bouncing around behind you. You can imagine wearing it. It just had to have felt terrible. But that's what it looks like, 3 long chimes wrapped up in muslin. So bustles by 1900 were pretty much disappearing. Sure, you can pass it around. Dina, could you give me a glass of water? I've got something in my throat. Our next model, come on in, Virginia. We're going to go swimming. 1910, what our bathing beauty is wearing. Maybe I should say what she's not wearing. She's about half here. If she were to show up on a beach in 1910 this way, she'd probably be arrested for having bare legs. What's not here to complete the outfit are the bloomers or the pantaloons made of either black sateen or some kind of a duck material. They'd be puffy and go to the ankle. Then she'd have rubber bathing shoes and rubber bathing socks, and these were rubber knee socks. You put them on, and then the little black rubber shoes, they look like rubbers like we used to slip over our shoes to go to school when it rained, and you'd roll up the shoe and the sock, and you'd put them in a little kit. They look like a shaving kit, and you'd carry them to the beach. Under the white hat, you'd have a rubber hat to keep your hair dry. The white hat went over it for decoration, or sometimes they'd have a scarf, maybe tied in a big bow, and then you had your parasol. So yes, you did actually swim in it. I talked to women who remember having a mother or somebody who wore these. It's made of a fabric called linsey woolsey. It's a linen wool blend. It's scratchy. Women, I say, didn't it feel horrible when they got in the water? And they say, no. They repelled water very well. You didn't feel wet. I said, well, yeah, it's because you had all those clothes on. But they said the problem was you got in the water and the whole thing would puff up around your waist like a jellyfish. Thank you. Okay. The fabrics of this era, pre-World War II fabrics, are a really great reason to collect. There are so many fabrics that are gone, and if somebody doesn't catalog them, and I don't even know what they are half the time, but I've run across fabrics like linsey woolsey and messaline, which was very big in the 20s, brilliantine, which was big during World War I, dimity, lawn. How many of you remember pongee? Yeah. Ladies that remember pongee? Yeah, it's a fabric that's gone. It was a beautiful, kind of a slubby, tan, silky type fabric, beautiful, but it's gone. After World War II, we get all these synthetic fabrics in, and then all these old fabrics are gone. I had one dress, I really didn't know what it was. It felt silky to me, but I didn't think it was silk. And I usually take them with me. And I went to a nursing home, and I knew there'd be a lot of really older women there. And I asked these ladies if any of them knew what it was. And one lady there who was close to 100 felt it. She was almost blind, and she said, well, this is bombazine. She said, I had a dress of this. And so it's probably 1890s, early 1900s. And I've read about bombazine, but I had no idea what it felt like. It's a silky, open weave type fabric, beautiful fabric. So that's a good reason for collecting. You may wonder why the puffy front on her swimming suit. Well, this is a great way to date clothing. The puffy front came in from about 1904, 1905 until about 1910. The reason for that was because of Charles Dana Gibson. He drew the Gibson girl. And the ideal of the Gibson girl was what was called the backwards S shape or the pigeon-breasted shape. The corset you like this with the bust out, the back out, and gave you that backwards S shape. And that's what everybody wanted to work for. So clothing, because you were corseted like this, clothing was puffy in the front. And if you see pictures of women I see them walking down the street holding in a parasol, and they're walking, like this. They look like their hips are out of joint. It just looks terribly uncomfortable. The corset that did that to you was called, of all things, the health corset. That's how advertisers sold it, because they didn't think women would want to buy it otherwise because it's so miserable. But it was the health corset. It puts you in that wonderful pigeon-breasted look, and that lasted for about 5 years. So when you find the puffy-fronted blouses or dresses, they came from 1905 to 1910, right in there. The parasol, well, the parasol was not an accessory. It was considered a necessity for women. They prized the lily white skin, keeping their skin very pale. That was a sign of social class. If you were tanned or freckled, you were telling the world that you didn't have enough money to hire somebody to work in your garden or work in your yard. So you had the big hats, high necks, long sleeves, parasols to keep your skin very pale. Women did a lot of strange things to keep their skin pale. I had a grandmother who was probably the most practical, down-to-earth woman I've ever known. But she and her sisters would only wash their faces in buttermilk because they said it kept their skin pale. Other women who would only wash their faces in rainwater. Lily Langtry, the famous actress, notorious actress, would often sleep with raw veal on her face because she thought it kept her skin pale. English women and New England women, probably the same ones that were having ribs removed, were taking pinches of arsenic to keep their skin pale. That's gone back hundreds of years. George Washington did it, Thomas Jefferson, all this English aristocracy did that, which is why they always look so pasty in these pictures. But you take a pinch of arsenic. Now, how you determined how much arsenic would keep you pale and how much would kill you, I don't know. But evidently they did, because they did that for years and years, and upper class women did that too. So that was a footnote to history. I've never found anybody in Iowa who did that, but that was common on the coast. So our bathing beauty of 1910, this outfit is from Centerville. It's hard to find these in Iowa. As you can imagine, we're a landlocked state. If you were swimming, it was probably in a farm pond behind the barn. A lot of women didn't have outfits like this. But when I do find them, say in Chicago, if you go to museums around Chicago or New York, like around summer cottages where there was a lot of money, you'll find pink and black ensembles with pink and black polka dot parasols, or orange and black striped suits, beautiful outfits. You just don't find that in Iowa. Most of them are black or navy or maybe dark green.
What's the construction under the skirt?
It's just, I put a slip on with it because it's sheer.
Didn't it have?
It would have had pantaloons, bloomers. Yeah, but since it's a fairly sheer fabric, I gave her a slip. But yeah, that's it. It's just kind of a skirt with a pretty tight waistband.
She can walk down the street and
not cause any ripples. Good, thank you.
Is that the one you're using?
Yeah, it's a rough kind of coarse weave.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. Our next model, come on out, Mary. Just prior to World War I, we're getting into the era of the suffragette, the suffragist. I just got this dress in Pella about a couple months ago, and I haven't had time to do much with it. But if I'd had time, I would have made a sign or a banner that said "Votes for Women." If you see the old suffragist newsreels, these women, were parading down the street for women's rights, and they often wore dresses and outfits like this. One really defining look of the teen years was called the tunic look or the overlay look, and you'll find several layers, 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 layers all the way down. This is an era of clothing. Okay.
Just trying
to get you on the fair. Okay. This is an beautiful era of clothing, but the clothing is difficult to fit because a lot of it is made up of just tons of hooks and eyes and snaps and little buttons. I've got one dress from this era that has 70 hooks and eyes, and the reason for that was the sleeves hook an eye off if you wanted to put something else underneath it. Yeah, the top skirt will hook an eye off so you can put another overskirt over it. It was very many practical options for women, but it makes it really hard to figure out how it goes on somebody. The difference between a suffragist and a suffragette, and I I've talked to women about this. I used to use the term interchangeably, and I had a lady correct me and say, "You don't know the difference, do you?" And I said, "No, I guess I don't." And she said, "Well, suffragists were in the U.S. and she said they were more ladylike than they were in Britain. So in the U.S. we never had the violence that they had in Britain, although I think they got pretty violent. But she says it was worse in England. And this lady was writing a book on it also for University of Iowa Press. So I thought, well, she probably knows what she's talking about. But she said the suffragettes came from England, and she said in about 1910, as the whole movement was heating up, the U.S. women imported these women from England to kind of get the movement really going here. And she said that's when the violence came in the U.S. The suffragettes from England were very, very intense. You know, they were the ones who were chaining themselves to light poles and breaking the windows of golf courses. And I said, well, why would they break the windows of golf courses? She said, well, in England, she said the term golf originally was an acronym that meant gentlemen only, ladies forbidden. And she said the first thing women did was go break the windows of golf courses or even burn them down like the clubhouse because they were not allowed to golf. And she said when those women came to America, that's when you really see the whole movement heating up here and more violence and women being jailed and force-fed and hunger strikes and all that kind of thing. So I found that an interesting distinction, that the difference between the two. One thing that came back in about this time, right about World War I, was the hobble skirt. I never could understand that. You know, it was big in the 1880s. It came back in about 1916. And again, it was so tight from the knees down, you had to hobble in it. And they were very dangerous. You read news clippings of women who would lose their balance and fall because they were so tight around their ankles. I talked to a woman from Iowa City who said her mother would come to Des Moines from Iowa City to visit her father, who was stationed at Fort Des Moines during World War I. And she would try to come up to see him, but she couldn't get on the train because her hobble skirt was so tight, she would have had to have pulled up her skirt to her knees to get on. And of course, that was totally unacceptable. So she made a bargain with the conductor that if she would shop for him while she was in Des Moines, he would lift her on and off the train so that she could get to Des Moines. They were that tight. Another woman in Charles City, she was about 100, and she told me she was quite the lady. She said, I remember wearing those hobble skirts. And she says, I have to tell you, you had to take them down from the top if you had to go to the bathroom because they were too tight to get up from the bottom. And she also told me that there was a song or a poem printed about hobble skirts in the paper. She said it was in the Minneapolis paper. And she said it had several stanzas, but she could only remember one, and I'm dying to try to find the rest of it. But the stanzas she could remember went, here comes a lady in her hobble skirt, looking so cute, looking so pert, bound at the bottom, bound at the top, she looks like a weenie from the butcher shop. If you see pictures of these hobble skirts, that's what they look like. They were real tight, waisted and on the hips, and then kind of a blouson until the knees, and then real tight down. I don't have a hobble skirt from this era. They only lasted about a year, and I'm dying to find one. I would love to see how they're constructed and how they actually look on somebody. But they didn't hang around too long, and by the time World War I was over, the hobble skirt was pretty much gone. Thank you. I need a volunteer to come up for my next. Anybody ladies want to be my volunteer?
Is it big or little?
It's pretty good size. Come on up. No, I mean, it'll be way too, oh, you're awfully short. It'll be too long on you, but it'll be okay. It's a duster, yeah.
Oh, it's a duster.
If you were lucky enough to have a car in 1915 or 1910, you had to have a duster. Now, a duster was another practical item. You have to remember the early cars were, well, you were going to get dirty. The joke of the day was that for every hour you spend inside your car, you'll spend 2 hours outside of it, pushing yourself out of the mud, changing flat tires, finding a farmer to haul you home. If you read letters to the editor, Des Moines Register of this era, when the automobile first came in, 1909, 1910, around here, these farmers around Des Moines write these letters, and they say, you know, you rich Des Moines people come out on Sunday afternoons with your automobiles, and you scare our horses, and then you get stuck in the mud, then you expect us to haul you back to town with our horses, you'll pull you back in. So they were not real popular, but this is the thing that both men and women had them. You'd put them over your clothing. They were usually real big because you had a lot of clothing underneath it, real loose. And when you got to your destination, you know, we have glove compartments, which seems kind of an anachronism. We don't put gloves in them. Many of the early cars had duster compartments. My parents have one. And you would throw your duster in there when you got to your destination and your clothing would be clean. Men would have the little motoring bonnets, little flat hats with the goggles. If you ever see the pictures, their eyes would be white and everything else would be black because they got dirty. Women had the big Merry Widow bonnets. Try and get you in this here.
The veil in the front.
The veil goes in the front, yeah. There you go. Pull it off your eyes a little bit so you can see. There you go. Now that would protect your face, protect your makeup. Many of these hats, this one doesn't do it, but many of these hats had snaps or hooks around the crown and on the veil, so you could mix and match colored veils. You might have a yellow veil or a green veil, and you could change from week to week. Sometimes they would snap on the side, long streamers, and you'd tie them under your chin. People always remark when they see hats especially, they'll say, you know, it doesn't look right compared to pictures I've seen. Well, the reason for that, in 1915 or 1910, you know, she'd have waist-length hair, and she'd put that up on top of her head. That hat was going to sit a good 4 or 5 inches taller than it is right now with the hat pins through it. So because we don't have the right hairstyles, hats don't look the same. A lot of times when I find these hats, they're getting really hard to find. But when you do find them, people have usually added like a strap under the chin or something to hold it on because they don't want to stay on very well by themselves. This was called a Merry Widow hat. Came in 1909 with the Merry Widow waltz. Very large. In New York City, they got so big that reports were women couldn't get through the trolley car door openings. But you find that a lot. Music would influence fashion. Fashion would influence music. A lot of the songs of this era were about automobiles. Come Away With Me, Lucille, and My Merry Oldsmobile came out about then. And you start finding Dreaming, a lot of these songs that mention automobiles in them, which I find interesting how they affected the culture, not only automobiles, but music and clothing because of it. And the duster was very much a part of that. It came about as a practical way to ride in an automobile. Do you want to stroll for us? Look up. There's an old saying, that's 30s, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is the end of World War I, and remember, corsets are gone, and what many magazines, including Vogue, are saying at this point is, you know, if we don't have to wear corsets anymore, why do we have to wear tight, form-fitting clothing? Why can't we wear looser clothing? Other things that influenced the looser clothing of the 20s, well, World War I. There were already women working in men's positions during World War I. New York City alone had 10,000 women running trolley cars during World War I because there weren't enough men to do it. So these women had worn this, you know, looser clothing to do these jobs, and they didn't want to go back to tight-fitting clothing. The V-neck came in right around World War I, and boy, was that a nice thing for women to get away from the tie necks. Women got the right to vote in August of 1920. Prohibition came in 1920. All of these things combined to really change clothing and to change the idea of what women could do and what they could wear. You see the term flapper. We always talk about flappers. It's interesting to see how that term was used. In Iowa, flapper was a largely derogatory term. Your mother would say, "You don't want to be a flapper, do you?" You know, it was like a hussy or someone who wasn't very nice. The term I find in Iowa more often is vamp or vampire. I bought a 1922 University of Iowa yearbook, and the center spread is the 5 most beautiful vamps on the U of I campus. It looks kind of like a homecoming spread. On the West Coast, the term was jazz baby, but they all sort of meant the same thing. It was this woman who was liberated. The term flapper, you may wonder where that came from. It doesn't have anything to do with sequins and fringe that flapped. It has to do with Betty Boop. And if you remember the old Betty Boop cartoons, she was the first flapper. She had the long raincoat, the black Arctic galoshes. They were Arctic brand. I'm told they had 3 buckles, and you left the buckles open, and when you walked, the buckles flapped. And that's where the term flapper came from. Some of you remember the time of that. Is there anybody here who was a genuine flapper? Anyone old enough to remember? Or had an older sister or somebody who was a flapper?
I have a picture of my mother in flapper attire.
Okay, short,
My mother always.
A long-waisted
long way, drop waist, yeah.
stuff, and hair short.
Yeah.
And
Cloche.
cloche.
Mm-hmm.
My mother had a red cloche that I used to play with.
This is pre-pantyhose era, and women were rolling down their hose and rouging their knees, putting spots of rouge on their knees. If you were really cool, you drew little pictures on your knees. I'm told by women who did this that, you know, the slang of the day, if something was neat or cool, you said it's the bee's knees. And women were drawing little bumblebees and ladybugs and things on their knees. So that was a big deal too, because you have to remember, you know, 1915, hemlines were just coming up. By 1925, they'd hit the knee, and boy, that was a big progression. It didn't happen overnight, but by 1925, at the knee was a big deal for a lot of people. Never got a lot shorter than that. You might see Broadway, you know, movies and shows that show really short skirts. They never got that short, but at the knee was still way shorter than anybody had ever seen them. We have a real flapper with us. Come on up. And they're beads, yes. We need about 4 or 5 strands of beads to really be in fashion. This brought up a whole other area of fashion. The look of the 20s was, you were in style if you had no hips, no waist, and no bust. You wanted the very flat silhouette, very straight. It was called the washboard silhouette or the boyish silhouette. Thank you. So, if you unfortunately had a bust line, you bought bust binders, and they look like big long ankle bandages that you would flatten yourself with so you could wear the clothing of the day. Many women tell me that their mother popped them into bust binders when they were 12 or 13 and starting to develop so they wouldn't develop so fast. You're shaking your head. Remember that? People doing that? Heard them talk about that. So that seemed to be a common type thing too. Sears catalog says the reason you want to buy the bust binders, this is how they sold them. They said you're going to have lots of beads, each maybe 4 or 5 strands, each one a little longer. If you have a bust line, your beads aren't going to hang straight, they're going to separate in the middle. So that's how they're pushing their the bust binders. Other looks, things of the 20s, well, the hair. You aren't going to get waist-length hair up under these little tight cloches. So women were cutting their hair, bobbing it, you know, Marcel waving it. This caused a lot of problems in a lot of families. Do any of you remember having problems with your parents or having mothers who had problems cutting their hair? Some of you are nodding. Anybody lose a job because of it? I'll tell you, I know of churches, there's 2 churches in Iowa that I know of that did not let women take communion who had cut their hair. Because of the verse in 2 Corinthians that talks about a woman's hair being her glory, was taken very seriously. One church told me, one of the ladies who was under the ban told me that when the minister's daughter cut her hair, suddenly the ban was lifted. But it was a big deal in a lot of places. A woman in Cherokee, Iowa told me she was a nurse in the 20s. She knew she'd be fired if she cut her hair. She didn't live in the town, she lived in an adjoining town. She went ahead and cut it, and she made it into 2 long braids, and when she went to work, she wound it up Heidi style over her ears and bobby pinned them on. It looked like she still had long hair. Mason City, Iowa, my favorite example, the fall of 1926 hired 2 new teachers. They did it all by mail, of course, and telephone. They told these women to send pictures with their applications because they didn't want to hire women with short hair. They wanted long-haired women. They hired these women, they got there in August, and both of them had cut their hair. So they didn't know what to do. So what the school board minutes say is that for the first 3 months of the school year, members of the school board will take turns dropping into these women's classrooms unannounced to make sure they aren't corrupting the morals of the children. That's how it was seen by a lot of people. Cutting your hair was not a fashion issue, it was a moral issue. And so you hear of a lot of fights with parents. Mothers were mostly for it. They were sick of that long hair. It was a lot of work to keep up. But men, fathers, boyfriends, husbands were not always for it. So it was slow going. But by 1925, 1926, most pictures you look at, most women have bobbed hair. It didn't go from long to short. There was a wonderful period in the early 20s of a hairdo called rats. I don't know if any of you remember rats. Or they were called on the East Coast cootie garages. I don't know if any of you, I think they were just an awful style. Nobody looked really attractive in it. You parted your hair down the middle, and you pulled it to the side, each side, and then you made 2 rats, one over each ear, and you used either wire, little pieces, kind of like, look like that bustle, or you used your own hair to fill it out and fluff it out so you had a rat over each ear. Wasn't a real attractive style, but that was kind of what it went from waist length to rats to the shorter bobbed hair, which was very sharp. You know, when you see the Marcel waves, the rows of very, very sharp hair for the 20s, but you had to have it to wear these little tight hats. Thank you. I want to show you what happens to dresses from the 20s if you don't take care of them. Most dresses in the 20s were made of crepe silk or crepe georgette, crepe chiffon, very thin fabrics. This is a crepe silk dress. And they just literally, well, you can see what they do. They just disintegrate. This was a fantastic dress, I think, at one time. The people who gave it to me a few years ago, it was already falling apart, and the reason for that was because it had been on a hanger. The 3 things you cannot do if you want to save silk clothing or crepe clothing from the 20s and 30s, you cannot put it on a hanger. The weight, this is a very heavy dress, and the weight of the dress will pull down, it'll rip your shoulders out, and then the whole thing will fall apart, which is what happened here. Don't wrap it in tissue paper. Tissue paper, the kind you get from Yonkers or Von Maur, has an acid. It's okay for today's fabrics, but it will eat through your old clothing very quickly, and I found that out the hard way. Don't fold it. Fold marks are very brittle, very fragile. I don't know if you've ever bought antique pillowcases at an auction and you try to put them, they've been in a plastic bag folded for 25 years, and you put them on your pillow and they rip right up the fold marks. Don't fold them. What you want to do with dresses like this is get something with a high cotton content, a tablecloth or a pillowcase or a blanket or something, lay your dress on it and then roll the whole thing up like a jelly roll. And that rolls the weight evenly. The cotton will keep dampness and bugs and things away from your clothing, and that's what I do with all these really old dresses that are in real fragile shape. This one was neat. It had a scalloped hem that kind of went like this. It has a tag in it that says size 18, and people laugh and say, wow, women were getting bigger in the 20s. No, they weren't getting bigger. They quit wearing corsets, and that immediately made clothing larger. The problem with 20s clothing is, though, I get a lot of phone calls from people who say, you know, I have this beautiful 20s wedding dress from my grandmother, my daughter wants to wear it, and it looks like it should fit. They were about the same size. It fits over the hips. Why can't we get it on across the shoulders and across the bust? Say it's because your grandmother was bound when she was wearing it. And so that makes 20s clothing a lot of times a size or 2 smaller on top than on the bottom, which is too bad, but it's hard to get on. Sizing has changed dramatically. It says size 18. I would call it about a size 12, 14 in our sizes. What was a 12 in the 1950s would be like an 8 today. So sizing has changed. However, women have not. That's another myth I'd like to explode. Women were not so terribly, terribly small as what we imagine. There were some, of course, who were really tiny. But the only 2 places Vogue magazine says that women have gotten bigger in the past 100 years is through the shoulders and through the feet. The corset is what did the rest of it. So if I could take 10 inches off all of your waists tonight, you know, you'd be wearing a lot smaller clothing too. So the clothing is small, but the women weren't as small as what we think that they were. There's an old saying that says when the stock market goes up, hemlines go up. When the stock market goes down, hemlines go down. That was really true in the 30s. The stock market crashed in October of 1929. Already the next spring, by March, April, hemlines had dropped. Our next model, come on out. Wearing a suit from about 1933, came from Des Moines. The woman who gave it to me gave me 5 or 6 suits that were real similar to this one, and she called them working girl suits. She said they were the kind of suits you wore if you had a white-collar job. She was a secretary in an insurance agency downtown Des Moines, and this was the kind of suit that they would wear. 30s clothing is beautiful, fantastic clothing when you can find it. It's feminine, it's graceful, a lot of the butterfly sleeves, drop waist, tie in the back, gorgeous clothing. Flowered fabric was coming in, sheer flowered fabric. I'm still looking for the ultimate 30s ball gown. They were flowered and sheer and form-fitting, very tight and cut down to the waist and the back. Beautiful. Well, how many women in Iowa had a ball gown during the Depression? Not very many. What's happening to those, I went to an auction in Fairmont, Minnesota about 10 years ago, and they had 4 of these dresses on it, 4 of these ball gowns, and they were fantastic. And I thought, if I can get one, I will be so happy. And I got there, and a guy from Denver was there, and he bought all 4 of them at $375 a piece, so times 4. And that's been 10 years ago. And I said to him, I said, what are you going to do with them? Are you a collector? And he says, no way. He says, I'm shipping these things to San Francisco tomorrow, and I'm going to double my money on them. And that's what's happening to a lot of Iowa's fashion heritage. It's getting drained out of the state. It goes to San Francisco or Portland, Oregon, which are big on the West Coast, Chicago, New York, in the Midwest and East, and that's what's happening to a lot of it. You know, finding 30s clothing is tough, and I don't think that's a big mystery. If your family was like my family during the Depression, you wore it and wore it and wore it, and then you wore it some more, and then you cut it down for your kids or made it into a quilt or curtains or something. So finding beautiful outfits that are in good shape is really hard to find. What strikes me is that when I do find 30s clothing, you know, I don't have a whole lot of it, but when I do find it, most of it is some shade of burgundy or plum or mauve. So I don't know if that's just a weird coincidence or if that was just a really popular color. If you watch the old movies like Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, and you look at these clothes, you know, they're so graceful and so feminine. I'd love to find more, but they're hard to find. This is the first suit I have that has shoulder pads. You can feel they're little puffy ones here. Because of Joan Crawford, she made the shoulder pad popular. She decided in the movies that her waist looked too big, and her fashion advisors told her to start wearing a cincher, as they were called, or a girdle. She didn't want to do that, so they said, well, if you get more width across your shoulders, it will make your waist look smaller. So she started wearing big, bulky shoulder pads. By 1935, almost every outfit has kind of a square look, almost a mannish look in jackets. I call this my Bonnie and Clyde suit. I watched an A&E biography the other night on Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrows, and she had a suit very similar to this one, but she was wearing a cloche with it. So if you had a Tommy gun under one arm, you'd look the part. You could take out the local bank. But it was a very common look for the early 30s. My sister wore this suit to church for about, a season, and she had more compliments on it. People are like, where did you get that suit? That's been about 10 years ago when 30s fashion was really back in. And she says, well, it's the original thing. I didn't buy it at Yonkers, so, but it's a classic, and it really never goes out of style. Thank you. Anybody remember from the 30s, any of you have what were called the Austrian hunting hats? I wish I'd brought one. They look like little stovepipe type hats with a little brim. They were real popular in the 30s too. I've got some of those. Should have brought one of those along. As we get into the 40s, into the war years, we had victory garments, victory bonds, victory gardens. A victory jacket was only supposed to be 26 inches long to conserve fabric. Jackets were short, skirts were short and tight. Fashion kind of shut down during the war. The one fashion that really did come out of the war years was the snood. Did any of you wear a snood? Yeah. The net that caught your hair in the back? Sure did. Did it have a hat attached or anything, or was it just, did you wear it alone? A ribbon. Okay. Blue with the blue ribbon. You wore it alone? Okay. Was anybody here a Rosie the Riveter? Anybody work in an ordnance plant, or was a whack or a wave or anything? Were there any ordnance plants around here?
Burlington.
Burlington. Oh, anybody work there?
My dad.
Your dad did, okay. Did you work there?
Yes.
Okay, what did you do?
I worked in the fuse line, and I was also a supervisor later.
Okay, fuse line. What exactly is that? Does that mean? What did you do?
Put pieces in, make fuse.
Make fuses, okay. What did you wear when you went to work? Was it like a coverall type thing?
Well, we didn't have to wear certain clothes where I worked.
I'm just wondering if you wore pants to work or not. You did, okay. Did you wear a snood to keep your hair out of the? You didn't wear a snood, okay. How much did you get paid an hour? Do you remember?
Well, that was why I went, because I was out of high school at 16, and then I went on to college. I mean, I couldn't get a job at Schaefer, so I went to Burlington. We got good money, but I can't remember what.
Okay, good then. You're right, right. Anybody else here work in an North plant? Anybody work in the shirt factory at Fort Madison that made Army shirts? That's an interesting story. These women that worked there would enclose little notes with the shirt and start writing to these men, And there's a story there, and since I do writing, I really want to follow it up. There were a few marriages that came about because of women who had sewed a shirt, stuck her name and address in a pocket, and later on met up with the guy. So that was an interesting thing too. Anybody here get married during the war years, between 41 and 45? Nobody? Did you have a white wedding dress? No. What did you have?
Brown velveteen top and a gold skirt.
Okay, brown velveteen. And you wore it again to church and other occasions, and yeah. Anybody else married during the war? Yeah.
My parents were 42, and I have my mother's wedding suit.
And what is it? What color was it? Blue. Okay.
Slate blue.
Slate blue. Okay. Anybody else? You know, that's kind of a myth. The white wedding. I did a show a few years ago of 100 years of wedding dresses in Iowa. And people were disappointed, I could tell. They didn't say it, but of the 10 wedding dresses I had, 2 were white. And the thing people don't realize is that in Iowa, in the Midwest, white was not always a practical choice for a wedding dress. If you were going to spend a lot on a special dress, it had to be something you were going to wear again. Both of my grandmothers were married in long dresses that were lavender, but they cut them off for street length so they could wear them to church during the war. So a lot of times you couldn't get white fabric. You didn't know when your fiance was going to get leave. You didn't know when you were going to get married exactly. If you couldn't find white fabric, if you could get a hold of parachute silk, boy, that was lovely. A flawed parachute, it made beautiful silky fabric. If you could get a hold of, one woman told me in Shenandoah, Iowa, that she was married in a white eyelet shower curtain that her mother sewed up for her. You weren't picky about what you had. So white was not always the first choice. And after the war, you start finding more women routinely married in white, but before the war, you really don't, especially during the war. Of all the things, though, that were difficult to find to wear during the war, what do you remember as being the toughest? Hose. Did you wear leg makeup?
Yes.
Did you draw the seam up the back with an eyebrow pencil? You did, okay. Yeah, that's leg makeup, from what I've heard, might not have been too bad if it weren't 100 degrees or raining and the stuff would run. They'd ruin the insides of your skirts. Women tell me they'd sew extra strips on the insides of the hems of their skirts because it would ruin them on the inside. One woman told me she sat on her fiance's lap in his white Navy sailor uniform, ruined his uniform. She said he almost got keel-hauled when he got back to the ship. But leg makeup, did you have the special sandpaper to sand your legs before you put the makeup on?
No, you shaved your legs.
You shaved your legs. See, now around Pella, women tell me that we didn't have shavers because you didn't use your dad's. They didn't have women. She said there was a special real fine sandpaper. You sanded your legs smooth before you put the makeup on. But you used a razor. Your dad's razor, or did you have your own? You had your own, okay. Anybody else remember wearing leg makeup? Yeah, was it, how could you get it on evenly and not have streaks, I guess is what I was always wondering. Yeah.
I had silk hose for my 8th grade graduation. We'd been in California the summer before, because everybody was moving around jobs. My dad got a job out there. And my aunt lived near a hose factory. Mm-hmm. And so we bought silk hose for my 8th grade graduation, which was not till the next spring.
There was a hosiery factory in Des Moines, Rawlings. If you worked there, you could get hose and then you would, hoard them. Did you store them in a canning jar so they wouldn't snag? Women tell me that they were smooth, they'd stick them in a canning jar so that they wouldn't snag because it was smooth and round. If you were a whack or a wave, you would get, like if you were a nurse in the Army, you'd get all the white hose you wanted, so you would dye them and sell them to your friends and make money on them. How many of you had the hook that you could repair your own hose? Look like a crochet hook. Any of you repair your own hose if it got a snag or something, silk hose? The weave of hosiery was much coarser in the 40s, and you could repair them. Yonkers had a lady in Des Moines who did nothing in the whole war but repair hose for women because they were that hard to find. Hosiery came in, nylon came in 1939, and then it was yanked out of production except for the wartime years in 1941. So women had just gotten a taste of nylon hose. Before that, they'd had either cotton or silk hose, which had pilled and got holes in them, or they went back to anklets during the war because you couldn't find the hose.
Then you wore as you in an office and wore hose, it was those horrible rayon ones.
Rayon, yes.
You had to wear a garter belt.
And they'd bag.
And they got longer.
Longer and longer, yeah. So women had just gotten a taste of nylon, and then it went. So it was really a horrible thing for women to have to go to the leg makeup and all that kind of stuff. You know, wartime fashions and deprivations, you know, of all the things that women did without, that seems to be the thing people remember. The hose and shoes. My mother was born in 1941, and she remembers distinctly not having any elastic in her underpants, that they snapped or hooked on, buttoned on the side, and you remember that, or tied. And I've heard so many stories of women who'd be in the middle of downtown shopping and that button would break and their underwear would fall on the ground. You know, it was an awful thing, but she, you know, my mom didn't even know until she was 6 or 7 years old that you're supposed to have elastic. They thought that they buttoned on the side. The other garment that comes out of this era, you know, in a rural community is the feed sack garment. You know, everybody either sewed or wore a feed sack garment, and that is such a rural thing. I was in Rockford, Illinois about 2 years ago, and I asked them, that's right outside Chicago, and I asked them about, you know, how many of you remember feed sack garments? And nobody knew what I was talking about. It's a very rural thing, and you'd remember, you know, my mom would always say, my grandma would send my grandpa down to pick up the feed, and she'd say, for Pete's sake, Henry, come home with at least 3 or 4 bags of the same material. So don't come home with 4 bags of 4 different kinds of material. But you know, it just seems funny if you were to tell a girl today, a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old girl, that your spring wardrobe is going to depend on the feed bags that come home from the feed store. It probably wouldn't go over, but that was a very common thing. My mother-in-law still gives me feed sack dish towels and, you know, used curtains, pillowcases. You did everything with them. And they were beautiful prints. They didn't lose their color. They stayed bright. And but that was a real rural thing. That's a part of Americana. After the war, next model, come on out. 1947.
The new look.
The new look, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
The hemline went down.
Hemline dropped, yes.
14 inches from the floor.
How many?
14.
14 inches from the floor. Okay, I didn't know there was an exact count on
When I
it.
graduated, that's what it had to be.
Okay. Well, I'd say it's a little long on you then. But you know, the war had closed down, pretty much closed down fashion. And after the war, the fashion industry is saying, how do we get women interested again in fashion? How do we rev it back up? Well, one thing that came in, Christian Dior in 1947 introduced the new look. And the new look dropped hemlines dramatically. And that caused a lot of problems for a lot of women. Around Pella area, what women did routinely was, in the 40s, you knew when you got married, you wouldn't have much money. So you made as many clothes ahead for your first year of marriage as you could. So one woman tells me she got married in January of 1947. She had all these clothes made. Well, in March or April, the new look comes in, drops hemlines, everything she has is too short. And she says, you know, she says, I bawled for about a week. She says, then I went home to my mother in South Dakota, and we spent 2 weeks taking all her garments apart, adding extra fabric at the waistband to drop them, and then making little bolero jackets to go over everything so that they'd be long enough. So the new look kind of screwed up a lot of women's plans, but it got women thinking about fashion again, using more fabric in garments. Another thing that came in the mid to late 40s was the peplum. Peplum, it was very graceful. Remember the peplum that came in about 10 years ago that looked like somebody tied a ruffle around your waist? It was looked like a clown. It was real ungraceful. The peplums of the 40s always lay very gracefully over the hips. And of all the dresses I have that I bring with me, I have more people tell me, I had a going away dress that looked just like that, or I had a best Sunday dress that looked just like that. It was a popular look. The hat, cartwheel hat, sometimes they were called, or pinwheel hats, big hats, you wear them at a slant. The reason for that was Veronica Lake originally with her page hairdo. You looked very dramatic if you had the hat at one angle and your page hairdo going like this on the other side. She has a very small head, so we're trying to keep the hat on her, but it was a very dramatic look for the late 1940s. Thank you.
Three dresses at least with peplums.
The other popular thing was the ballerina length dress, you know, the dropped waist. As we get into the 50s, fashion's getting looser, getting fuller. One fashion that came in the early 50s, maybe you remember, is the chemise. It was kind of a sack dress. It was very easy to sew, kind of a slip-over dress. Very full, very looser fashion. It wasn't as tight as it had been. By the mid-50s, you know, skirts were getting very big. If you were in high school or college, how many of you had a poodle skirt or had a daughter who had a poodle skirt?
And a can-can.
And a can-can.
Yeah.
How many of you still have your poodle skirts? Yeah, that's about par for the course. I asked that everywhere, and usually one or two people maybe still have them. Almost everybody had one at the time. I'm convinced that somewhere there's a tribe of mission children running around in poodle skirts, because that's what I hear. My mom sent it to missions. You know, they're really hard to find. As many people who had them, where are they all? I don't know. A lot of women tell me that their mother made them into Christmas tree skirts around the tree, because they made a perfect circle. The other thing, of course, was the prom dress, the strapless cotillion dress with either a little bolero jacket or a net stole that was long and tucked in the front, very full. I know what happened to these. These girls who wore these in the late 50s were the products of mothers who went through the Depression. And you find this over and over. They either took their dress and cut it up for something else, or if it was a white dress, they might have used it for a baptismal dress for their first child later on. Or in my case, my mother had a beautiful violet, purple, gorgeous dress. I got the dress, which I played with as a little girl, broke the zipper, ripped it up, you know, played with it. But I never got the stole. And I asked my grandma what happened to the big stole that went with it, because I've seen it in pictures. And she says, oh, it was just hanging in the closet. So I cut it in half and I strained grape jelly with half of it. And I hung potatoes in the basement in the other half. So, and that's, you hear that because these women are like, I'm not going to let this thing sit in the closet. We talk about recycling today, but you just have to talk to women who went through the Depression and World War II to talk about the ultimate recyclers are not going to let anything go to waste. So that's what's happened to a lot of that clothing. Come on in, our June Cleaver look-alike. Oh. Now, underneath this, of course, lots of can-cans. Show them your can-cans. Starched either with starch or sugar water. Anybody use sugar water? Make them stand way, way out. Did any of you go to a high school that had rules about how many can-cans you could have? Nobody? Some schools had rules. North High School in Des Moines said 3 can-cans per girl. And the way they tested that was you had to walk through the girls' bathroom door without your dress touching the sides. And I talked to the woman who was the vice principal there, and I said, well, what was the problem? And she said, oh, everything was a problem. She said girls were pulling up, you know, chairs to their desks because they couldn't get behind the one-piece desk. Driver's ed day, their dresses covered the entire console of the car. She said on choir day, you'd walk into the bathroom. You couldn't get these huge can-cans under choir robes. So on choir day, all these can-cans would be standing stiffly starched in the bathroom with little name tags on them. She said they just got to be a pain, so we said you have to be able to walk through the bathroom door and not be able to touch the sides. So can-cans, they were, my mom talks about how you would want, if you had, for instance, a black skirt, you wanted can-cans of different colors. So when you sat down, everybody would see your pink or yellow or blue can-cans all billowing up. And they're tough to find too, the can-cans. They're getting really hard to find. I don't know where, if they all have been destroyed by people or played with or sold or if we ended up at missions or what, but as many people as had them, it's hard to find good 50s examples of that kind of clothing. Anybody of you have a problem with wearing can-cans that you remember? My mom couldn't get through the bus door. She remembered not being able to get through the bus door with her 6 can-cans under her skirt. Yeah?
It was hard to get down through the aisle of the school bus.
Through the aisle of the school bus, yes. Any of you Baptists? Any of you baptized as a young girl with a dress with lots of can-cans? One woman told me she was baptized in a big white corduroy skirt with 4 can-cans. She got down in the baptismal pool of their church and she couldn't get up. And the deacons had to pull her up. And she said in the next week's bulletin was an announcement that said, young ladies who are being baptized are asked not to put starch in their undergarments because it makes a mess of the baptismal pool. So, something I hadn't thought about. But, you know, the 50s fashion is really a lot of fun. When I was in high school in the late 70s, when we had homecoming, you know, we had 50s day and everybody wanted to dress up in 50s clothes. I got a call this fall from some girls at Pella High who wanted to rent clothes, and I said, okay, what are you looking for? And she said, well, we're having 80s day at school. I said, 80s day? I said, I don't think I even want to talk to you. But so it's getting closer and closer. Thank you.
And we weren't dressed unless we had our hat.
That's right. You weren't dressed unless you had a hat and gloves. The hat Why did the hat disappear? Well, a couple reasons. In 1966, the Vatican II declared that Catholic women no longer had to wear a hat to Mass. The other thing that killed the hat was the bouffant or beehive hairdo. You couldn't have a huge hairdo and then put the hat on the top, or you'd look like the Cat in the Hat. So the hat pretty much died out by the mid-60s. I don't know how it is like if you go to organizations, but like in our church, if a lady's wearing a hat in church, we're all like, oh, who's got the hat on? It's so unusual. You know, 50 years ago, we'd all be sitting here with our hats and gloves and matching purses. So times have certainly changed. Mid-60s, come on in. Early to mid-60s. Nobody ruled fashion more than Jackie Kennedy, and her look was very straight, the pillbox hat. By the mid-60s, colors have kind of gone wild. Come on, this is our Marcia Brady dress.
Oh, yeah. Came back.
Anybody here married between 63 and 67 in those years? Nobody? Was your prom dress high-waisted like this? Yes. The daisies were pink, okay. This was a bridesmaid's dress from Pella, from First Reformed Church in Pella, worn in 1965. I have a lot of dresses from this era, and they're almost all some shade of green. Chartreuse or pea green or olive green, or it must have been a very popular color. But one way you can always tell these dresses is that they're high, you know, the empire waist, high-waisted, and usually have some sort of a bow. Now this one has daisies instead, but often you had a bow in the front or the back or maybe on the shoulders. The other thing that's interesting, my sister models this dress once in a while for shows, and after the last show she said, I'm not wearing that dress anymore because it has pointy bust darts. But now, if you remember what bras were doing in the mid-60s, they were pointed. And everything we wore had pointy bust darts. My mother sewed everything I wore until I started high school. I'm 6 years old running around in shirts with pointy bust darts, you know? I mean, that's what we had. And you look at clothing today, how unconstructed it is. Nothing has darts anymore. So that's a real change, but that's a real easy way to date clothing of the 60s. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I was in 4-H when I was little. And I think I spent 3 months having them show me how to make a dart, a proper dart. It's like all this training was wasted totally. I've never made a dart since, but they were very much in style in the mid-60s. The little hats, often they had, you know, this one has the little wires that you clench tighter if you need it. They give you headaches after you wear them for a little while, but very popular in the mid-60s. Thank you. Our next model, come on in. 1968. Dresses are getting shorter. I think the gal who originally wore this was taller. But most schools by this time, by the late 60s, early 70s, had a rule about how short dresses could be. If you went to school then, what was the rule where you went to school?
If you kneeled down, it had to touch the ground.
Was that a Catholic school?
No.
No, okay. Okay, if you had to kneel down, it had to touch the floor.
Fingertip length.
Yeah, that was the rule at our school. We had to stand with our arms at our side. It had to be as long as our longest finger. And I remember girls complaining about how unreasonably long that was. You do that. That's pretty short. Some high schools would send you home if your skirts were too short. Some high schools, I find this interesting, like Sheraton High School in Southwest Iowa, if your skirt was too short, they didn't send you home. They made you go to the secretary's office and stand on a chair, and she pinned rows of crepe paper around it until it was long enough. So they said, you know, you didn't do that more than once because it was too humiliating. But women, you know, tell me, girls tell me, women tell me who were in high school, then they'll say, you know, I think we went through high school dehydrated because nobody dared bend over to get a drink of water in high school. Skirts were too short. If you remember hosiery, the rings, brown rings we had on hose, the hose companies kept raising the rings because dresses were getting shorter and shorter. And I still remember in our church seeing girls walk to the front of church with the brown ring, you know, hanging out the bottom of their skirt. I didn't have any older sisters, but my friends all did. And their older sisters were wearing their father's shirts, dress shirts, belted as dresses. That's how short they got. This is also the era, if your church has choir robes for their choir, this is the era most churches said choir robes are in now because these girls were standing in front of church with really, really short dresses. Or at the organ, putting a box around the organ bench or something because the dresses were so short. If you look back at pictures of yourself wearing them, We look so silly wearing these really, really short dresses. Vogue magazine says if you wore mini skirts the first time around, you're too old the second time around. So something to remember. Thank you. I don't know if any of you remember the television show Room 222. Karen Valentine had a dress just like that one in that show, almost exactly the same. I remember watching that. Our last outfit, probably the most controversial, believe it or not, of anything we've had out here tonight. Come on out. Our pantsuit. Do any of you remember when you were working, if you were working in the late 60s or early 70s, what year you were allowed to wear pants to work? What year was it? 72. Where were you working?
Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles, okay.
And they had to be a real outfit.
It had to match, yes.
The tops,
Right. You couldn't just wear pants with a sweater or blouse. It had to be the jacket with the pants, maybe a vest. You might have a vest underneath it. They're usually polyester, double knit, but that was the rule. Anybody else working somewhere where you remember problems with pants? Yeah.
I graduated from nurses training in 1971, and my class was the first class that showed us
That got to wear pants. Yeah. Nurses and kindergarten teachers, what I find, were usually the first ones to wear pants because the rationale was that kindergarten teachers are on the floor with the kids more. Nurses, I hear all kinds of stories from women who say, it was obscene to have to make a bed in those tiny short dresses, to reach across a bedroom. One woman told me that one of the patients' wives complained to the nursing staff that her dress was too short. So the pants came in as a necessity. The other thing that helped pants was the energy crisis. As thermostats got cranked lower and lower, more places decided to let women wear pants. And it was such even as a little girl, I remember we weren't allowed to wear pants to school till I was in probably 2nd or 3rd grade. That would have been about 70, 71. And I still remember as a little girl thinking, why are we allowed to wear really, really short skirts? We have to put shorts underneath them and then pants in the winter, get to school, take off the pants. That never made any sense to me, but we weren't allowed just to wear pants outfits. The other struggle was blue jeans. We were allowed to wear pants. When I was a sophomore in high school in 78, a couple of girls staged a sit-in in the school at Pella Christian High School because the boys were allowed to wear jeans and girls weren't. And we sat in the hallways for about 3/4 of a day before the administration said, okay, you can wear blue jeans on Fridays. So that was the first concession, so we got to wear them on Fridays. But that was our big protest. So, but the pantsuit was very controversial. A lot of places banned them, thought they were unladylike. In our church, I still remember it was like, is it okay to wear pants to church? Okay, you can wear them at night and during the week to activities, but not on Sunday mornings, that kind of a thing. So it was a real controversial thing. Thank you. Yeah.
I started teaching at North Minneapolis, and it was in it was either 1970 or 71. And the pantsuits were, really popular. And so what we did as a staff, it was all fairly young teachers. We got together and decided on this one day we were all going to wear our pantsuits because we thought they surely won't send all of them.
Okay.
We did it in mass.
And what happened?
Nothing happened.
Nothing?
But everybody was afraid individually to do it.
Right. I remember my mother calling up her friends and saying, I'm going to wear my pantsuit tonight. Are you wearing your pantsuit? Let's all wear our pantsuits, to a potluck or something. It's like a bunch of little kids, calling each other up. But it was you didn't want to be the one standing out, wearing the pantsuit. So it was a real controversial outfit, yeah. As we've gone through the last 100 years, 125 years, people, I know you can't save everything. It's impossible to do that. But save a couple of your favorite garments and put with it a note, where you wore it, who you were with, if you have a picture of yourself wearing it or a program that went with the event. I have one wedding dress from 1885 that has the invitation that came with it. So I know exactly who wore it, when, where. That's wonderful to have. Also put how much the outfit cost or how much the material cost you to make it. You think you'll remember down the road, but you probably won't, and so having a note will help. People ask me what's going to be collected in the next 20 years, and it's crazy. When I started collecting, I stopped at 1970, and now I'm going up into the 80s. Stuff I wore in high school is now going sky high. Gunny Sacks dresses with Jessica McClintock label on them. I just saw them on the internet for going between $150 and $200. Yeah, I have one too, and they were very expensive. Mine was my 8th grade graduation dress. My mom paid $79 and about had a cow, but now they're going for about double that. The original toe socks, they were like socks, like gloves. Now they're kind of coming back, but the original ones where each toe had an individual thing, they were wild colors. They're going for about $20 to $25 a pair. Gaucho sets from the late 70s with the boots and the little bolero jacket. They're going to be going high if you have the boots that go with it. So keep a couple of your favorite things. That if you have something that's different, that only lasted a trend that lasted a year or two, keep it. Those are the things that are really going to be looked for. The bubble dress of the mid-'80s, it lasted 1 year. It looked like a big inner tube around your body. That's going to be worth some money. So, more than money, it'll be worth some memories, things that you remember. Bring back a lot of memories. So, anybody have questions or remember? We went through a lot of things fast. Remember a style that we didn't talk about? Yeah, thank you.
My mother in the 40s crocheted and knitted beautiful dresses and hats and bags. It all went together and sold them to department stores.
Oh, wow.
To make money because my father was a preacher and he didn't have any money. So she sold them for fabulous amounts of money. And
wow.
I have one now that I would like to
oh, yes.
get to you if you'd like.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. The other thing that women crocheted during the war was rubber pants for their babies. Did any of you crochet those? Because there was no rubber. So you crocheted. What did you use for material?
They were soakers.
Soakers, yes, that's what they were called. And what kind of a thread, though, did you use to do them? It's kind of a wiry type yarn that was...
There wasn't rubber pants.
No, there wasn't rubber pants.
So, yeah.
So you crocheted these pants to go over kids.
Another thing you didn't talk about, they weren't formals, but they were long dresses that you wore in the evening.
Okay, evening gowns. Oh, yes.
They weren't bare and that's
no, maxi skirts is what we called them, yes. Who else? Somebody else had their, yeah.
The trapeze dress.
Trapeze dress or baby doll, yes. A very popular maternity type look in the 60s and 70s. Any of you have paper dresses from the 60s? You had a paper dress. Any of you have paper curtains during World War II? I'm told paper curtains were kind of popular.
We did it.
Edible what? Edible clothing, yes, yes. Anybody else have a question or anything you'd like to know about? Can't guarantee you I can answer it, but...
I just have, my grandmother bought a fur coat, like in, I think it was the late 40s or early 50s, and apparently that was really popular at that time.
Oh yes, the fur was very big. Eleanor Roosevelt made the fur very popular, and you see pictures of her with all the furs draped around her. Unfortunately, the fur has unfortunately, the fur has gone out of fashion, and it now looks like the pendulum is kind of swinging back. What made me angry was when they put the Roosevelt Monument up in Washington, D.C., they originally were going to put Eleanor with him, and they didn't. When we went last summer, it's just him and his dog, Fala, the dog thing. They were going to put Eleanor with her, and they had almost every picture you see of her, she has furs, and they were not going to put furs on her because it was politically incorrect. And I'm like, I don't care what your view is on furs. She made the fur a status piece. In the 40s and 50s, that was the thing. And I get more calls from women. Today I got a call from a lady who says, I want to sell some fur coats. And I said, I'm sorry, there is no market for them. They're big and bulky. I know people who sell them to Cabela's to make fishing lures out of them, fur coats, or make a teddy bear out of them for their grandkids. But there's really right now no market for fur coats, but almost everybody had one. And did it have the head attached?
No.
Oh, the head and tail? Okay. The big shawl.
Yeah, the fur pieces.
Yes, fur pieces.
But that's how we survived in the Depression. My dad was a trapper.
Right.
Sold the furs.
Right. They were very popular. Yeah. Yeah.
My aunt had the fox that the head and
Snapped it onto the tail, yes.
my sister and I used to play with that.
Yeah. They give me the creeps. They have those amber eyes. They kind of...
There was a fox jacket called a chubby.
A chubby.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was good.
Yeah.
I remember as a little girl, this would be 60s, on the way to church, we had our white glove, and we had a muff, a fur muff.
Yes. I had muffs too. The other thing I remember from the 60s very distinctly is, I was a little girl in the late 60s, but being on the bus and seeing these big girls get on with these mother-approved skirts on and then ruling them real short. And then unwinding them again at night when they got off the bus. And the mother couldn't figure out why she's getting a call from the teacher, that this girl has a really short skirt on. But that happened a lot. Fishnet hose. Fishnet hose, yes. And the go-go boots. Right. Well, I have a brochure up here if you're interested in picking one up or talking with me afterwards. Otherwise, thank you for coming this evening.